In 1989, an archaeologist called Greta Lillehammer wrote what was possibly the first article about children and childhood in archaeology. And she pointed out that archaeologists had done a pretty poor job of talking about childhood in archaeology and reconstructing childhood. But imagine a world, imagine a street without children. It's a pretty absurd world, you'll agree. And yet, this is the world that archaeologists seem to be depicting in their work. But childhood is a universal state. We all were children at one point, and even though children don't play adult roles, they definitely contribute to society and to the world that we live in. But I hadn't heard about Lillehammer's work in 1989 for the simple reason that at the time I was 3 years old and I was too busy putting her theories into practice. For instance, one time me and my brother stuffed some toys into a plastic Playmobil chest and then buried it in our backyard, all the more to confuse some poor future archaeologist. And the funny thing is that it might, because even though I wanted my toy back by the end of the day, we went and looked for it, but we never did find it, so it is still out there somewhere. I wouldn't say that me and my brother were odd children. It is just we liked castles, we liked the past, we liked dungeons, we liked visiting cemeteries and churches. And especially what I liked to do in cemeteries was wandering around and reading people's names off of headstones and trying to imagine who they had been, how they had lived, who they were. And this feeling of wanting to reach out to people from the past has never really left me. This feeling stayed with me when I went off to university, and I ended up being distracted by various other topics within archaeology and ended up specializing in Egyptology, which is a really great topic when you are interested in cemetery sites because there are just so many of them. The first bit of major research I did concerned some tombs that were in an oasis. These tombs had been in use in 2400 BC, or about 4,000 years ago. And they had been used by ancient Egyptian dignitaries and their servants. And what was interesting about these tombs was that in the sloping entrances to them, often people were buried in positions that were subsidiary to the main tomb. And often these people buried in subsidiary positions were children. So the question was, why was this? What was the meaning of this? And this is when I caught up with the work of Lillehammer. And it was almost 20 years later, and many archaeologists had picked up on her work and carried it further with quite a lot of enthusiasm, so a lot had been written by this time. What I learned from these studies was that it wasn't unusual for children to be in odd burial arrangements. So them being in this secondary position to a main tomb was probably because they had not really earned any status for themselves, and were therefore granted secondary positions through charity, possibly. But even this is quite a big deal for an ancient Egyptian, because burial space does not just mean that you get buried somewhere. In this case, these people were also near a bigger tomb that had an active tomb funerary cult. This was beneficent for anyone who was buried in the main tomb or near the main tomb. But this arrangement had been thought up by adults and not by the children themselves. Basically, this said something about how children were viewed by adults and by those who took care of them. But it didn't really say anything about how they lived themselves, what they thought themselves. It wasn't really satisfying. This is when I became interested not just in studying burial arrangements, but in actually studying the remains of the individuals themselves. And this is when I decided to come to Sheffield. And within the discipline of human osteology, the importance of studying the remains of children had also been realized. And in the year 2000, the first major work about juvenile and child remains appeared. I came to Sheffield in the year 2009, which is almost 10 years after this first major work was published. But even so, it still felt like a fairly fresh topic, because within academia, 10 years is not quite as long as within our daily lives. The reason I was so excited about coming to Sheffield was not just that I could come study human remains, but also that there were several individuals here in the department who had specialized in studying children in the past specifically, and who had already done work about this and written about this. So here I got the chance to work with these people and to study the remains of children myself for the first time. I was lucky enough with this expertise to then go off and to do a PhD. And the topic I ended up studying was fairly specific. It concerned the identification of injuries in the remains of children from the medieval period. While this may seem like a horrifically specific topic to study, it actually makes quite a lot of sense to study injuries from past human remains. Because while a lot of the information that we can determine from the skeleton is important, it is also fairly generic. We can say what age someone was, we can say what height they had, we can say perhaps, if we're lucky, what diseases they had, what stresses they had, but nothing is more specific than identifying an injury. In a way, reconstructing an injury almost feels like having a conversation, because when you identify a fracture, you identify the remnant of one single instance, one moment, a fall, an accident. And by reconstructing these instances, we can guess at a specific experience of someone from the past. To show you what I mean, I will tell you the story of a child who was buried in Bishopsgate in what is today known as Spitalfields in the London suburb. We don't know much about this child. We don't know their name. We don't know where they came from, but what we can say is that they probably were buried in the 13th century. They were aged about 10 to 11 years old, and they had sustained a fracture of the upper leg, which I identified. While this may have been caused by a fall from a height, such as from a building or from scaffolding, I think that this child might have been in a traffic accident. And this may seem anachronistic, but it's actually not as anachronistic as it may sound, because in medieval London, there were quite a lot of carts moving through the streets, and these carts were really massive two-wheeled vehicles that were drawn by horses and that moved at a fairly slow pace, but carried very heavy loads, and occasionally carters would lose control and accidents could injure adults or children. From the X-ray, I could tell that the healing had been progressing very well, which likely means that the child was given some sort of time to recover, either by using crutches or through the use of a splint. While this story may seem patchy and incomplete, it actually tells us quite a lot, and it's just one of many such cases that I have discovered throughout my research. And through the combination of historical, pictorial, and archaeological evidence such as this, we can actually tell more and more detailed stories of children in the past. And I feel that this work is the culmination of wanting to reach out to the past and study people from the past ever since I was an oddball child reading names from cemetery headstones. And I'm happy to say that currently I'm contributing to the studies and research of studies in human osteology, people who have come to Sheffield just to study this subject. And while I feel that many of them were oddball children, that's okay, so was I.